This video will show how to create the following two small Scala programs. First, creating a new Scala file in an empty directory, implementing it with a trivial program, printing the classical phrase "Hello World" to the screen. Then the Hello World program will be replaced with another program, which receives input argument from the command line and also receives keyboard input from the user. This video is part of at least one playlist showing how to do the above with different programming languages. There should be a link to that playlist in the description below. Prerequisites. You, the viewer of this video, are assumed to have some skills in at least some programming language. I will not explain basic concepts such as what is a variable or what is an array or what is a for loop. Even if you have never written source code with Scala, you are assumed to be able to understand, for example, what this Scala code below does. In this video, I am using Windows 10, and I start by showing which version of Scala, SBT, and Java I have installed. Regarding SBT, it is the build tool, and is an alternative to Gradle or Maven, which you may be familiar with. The version of Java is 17.01. The version of SBT is 1.6.1. The version of Scala is 3.1. The Windows command dir shows that I am starting from an empty directory. Now I create a new directory called Scala with the Windows command md. Then I navigate into the new directory with cd Scala. Then I start Visual Studio Code by typing code and a dot, which is the path to the current directory. When Visual Studio Code has started, I create a new Scala file, arguments_inputs.scala, in the new Scala directory. Now I will implement the initial trivial Hello World program by first creating a main function. I am implementing the main function by calling the method println to print text on the screen. The method println belongs to the console object, but you do not have to import it since it is available through the alias in the so-called predef object. Now I am showing with the Windows command dir that the Scala file has been created in the Scala directory. The program can now be executed by typing Scala and then the file name. As you can see, the program now shows Hello World, just as expected. I have now used Scala 3, but will now show that this program does not work with Scala 2. I have therefore prepared a command window that I have started, where the environment variable path contains a path to Scala version 2. The Scala version is 2.13.7. When I try to execute the program in the same way I just executed it with Scala 3, then you can see that it does not work with Scala 2. To make it work for Scala 2, I can remove the annotation @main and change the main function so that it instead becomes a method in a singleton object with an arbitrarily chosen name. I can also mention that singleton is the name of a so-called design pattern, and it means that you create one single instance of a class, and there is built-in support for this in Scala. When you use the keyword object instead of class, an instance will be created automatically without having to write code yourself to ensure that there will be only one instance. In many other programming languages, for example Java and C#, there is something called static methods, which are used for methods that should belong to the class as a whole and not a specific instance. When you are using Scala, you can achieve a corresponding functionality with the help of object. And if you want to mix instance methods and class methods, you can use a so-called companion object inside of a class for the methods that should belong to the class instead of the instance. I am also adding a list of strings as argument for the main method, which at the execution can contain program arguments for the program if such arguments are provided. Now I am executing the modified program with Scala 3, and it still works. I am now also showing that Scala 3.1 is still used in this command window. Now I switch back to the command window for Scala 2. When I execute, you can see that the updated program now works, even with Scala 2. The updated program thus works with both Scala 2 and Scala 3. If you want the program to work with both Scala 2 and Scala 3, it is therefore better to use a method in an object instead of a main function annotated with @main. So far, I have executed the program directly as a script. In other words, I have not first compiled it to create a new file to be executed. But now I will compile the program and then use Scala C with the C as a suffix. When I then run the Windows command dir to display the files in the directory, you can see that there are now two .class files in the directory. As you may know, .class files are files that can be executed by a Java runtime. For example, you are creating .class files when compiling source code written with the language Java, but .class files can also be created for other JVM languages, such as Kotlin or Scala. The name of one of the .class files is equal to the name of the class, or the name of the object, plus the suffix .class. That name is myObject.class, while the name of the other .class file is almost the same, but with a $sign before the dot. To execute the compiled program, I am typing Scala and then the file name, excluding the .class file extension, for the file that does not contain the $sign in the file name. You can also execute the program with a Java runtime, but to make it work, the Scala library must be available. When you install Scala, it comes with a directory lib, and in it there is one file called Scala library, and then also a version number as well in the file name. I can also mention that I did not install Scala with an installer program, but instead I did it manually by extracting Scala from a downloaded zip file, and then created an environment variable, Scala_home, pointing to the directory where I extracted the Scala files. I will soon use my environment variable Scala_home when setting the path for the Scala library jar file with the class path flag -cp. Now I am using the Windows command dir to display the contents of the lib directory in the Scala home directory. As you can see, there is a file called Scala library 2.13.6.jar. I can then add that file to the so-called class path with the -cp flag. You can add multiple paths to directories and jar files by separating them with semicolons when you're using Windows, which I am doing here. But if you are using Linux, then you can use colon instead of semicolon to separate directories and jar files. When I now will execute the program with the Java runtime, I am adding the flag -cp and then two paths. First a dot for the current directory, because my own code, for example the code in the file myObject.class, should of course be available when executing the program. Then I add a semicolon as a separator because I'm using Windows, while you should use colon instead for Linux and Unix. Then I am adding the path for the jar file with the Scala library, which must also be available at the execution. I am using my environment variable Scala_home for the first part of the path, and then the file is in the lib directory, and the name of the file I will use is Scala library 2.13.6.jar. Please note that it works with forward slashes here to separate the directories and files, even though I'm using Windows, which normally uses backslashes in paths. Here my environment variable Scala_home refers to my Scala 3 installation, And as you can see in the lib directory, there is also a file Scala3 library 3310.jar. But here I am instead referring to Scala 2, since I changed the program to use code that also works with Scala 2. I did this earlier in the video by replacing the function with the annotation @main by instead using a main method in a so-called singleton object. After having entered the two paths in class path with the -cp flag, I mean a dot for the current directory and the jar file with the Scala library, then I am adding the compiled.class file, my object, but without the file name suffix .class. As you can see, the program works as before, when it now was executed with Java instead of Scala. Now I will replace the initial Hello World implementation with a program that will receive and print arguments from the command line. The program will also ask the user to enter the name, and will then print to the screen what the user typed. For this purpose, I have prepared some pseudocode that I will paste into the program, but within comments, because of course it would not be possible to execute. Then I will modify the code by changing it to Scala code that can be executed. Now I am showing how the program arguments will be provided to the program when it is executed. The arguments will be added after Scala and the file name of the compiled singleton object, excluding the file extension .class. We are using a space between each argument, so here I am showing 3 arguments for the program. The program arguments are received as a string array, which is an argument for the main method. The array of strings can be iterated in a for loop. Inside the loop, program arguments are printed to the screen by using the method println. Here I am creating the string with so-called string interpolation with an S as a prefix before the string and then a $sign before the variable name. I am using print instead of println to avoid line breaks at the end, since I want the input prompt to appear immediately after the question text in the same line. The method readLine can be used to receive input through the keyboard. That method belongs to the stdin object, which will soon become imported. The method readLine will return the text entered by the user. I am receiving the entered text into a variable, which is then printed to the screen with the method println together with the prefix hello, and again with string interpolation with the S prefix and a $sign and a variable name. I am removing the curly braces around the variable name because they are not needed here. However, curly braces can be useful in so-called string interpolation in the case of an expression, for example, calculating the sum of the values in 2 variables. But it is not needed here when using one variable in this way. The method readLine belongs to the stdin object in the scala.io package. Therefore, I am adding an import at the top of the file. Now I am compiling the program with Scala C, followed by the file name, which creates a .class file. And then I execute the program with Scala, and then the name of the .class file that was created during compilation, and then some arguments separated by spaces. The program works as expected. Now I will show how to run the program with SBT. You can generate a new SBT project by typing SBT new scala/hello-world.g8. During the project creation, I get a question about the project name, and I then choose the name inputs2, suffix 2, because I consider the previous non-SBT program as the first program. When the project is generated, a directory called inputs2 is created, and I navigate into it with the Windows command CD. When I look in the project's source directory, src, there is a file, main.scala, that contains the Hello World object that inherits from the trait app. Then I copy the code from the main method in the previously created Scala file into this new Hello World object. And when you inherit from app with extends app, you can put code directly inside the body of the object, so you do not need to create a main method. The program can then be executed by typing sbt and then run and the program arguments within quotes. If you would like to execute without sending any program arguments, then you can just type sbt run without quotes. As you can see, the program still works as expected, also now when it is executed with sbt.